The Vethka do not ask for help. Corpsman Second Class Darian Ose had been briefed on that fact 3 times before his boots ever touched Kareth IV's soil. Once by the cultural liaison officer at Titan Station, who said it with the detached precision of someone reading from a manual. Once by the combat medic who rotated out 2 weeks ahead of him, who said it with the flat voice of a man who had watched something die because of that fact. And once by the battalion chaplain, who said it while handing him a flask of something that tasted like fermented engine lubricant, and told him to consider it a gift for whatever moment he'd need it most. He was 26 days into his attachment, with the 3rd Vethka consolidated strike, when the moment arrived. The first days had been an education in invisibility. The Vethka did not ignore him. That would have required acknowledging him enough to actively dismiss him. They simply moved around him the way water moved around a rock, not hostile, not curious, purely functional. When he appeared at the forward triage point on his 2nd day, the unit's existing medic, a Vethka named Korchet, who was perhaps 50 years old by the human estimate, and who looked at Darian with the expression of someone inspecting a piece of equipment of uncertain utility, pointed him to the supply rack, indicated the 2 warriors currently waiting for treatment, and then left to attend to other business. The 2 warriors were young, relative to what he'd seen. One had a cracked ventral plate from a fall that had been assessed as non-critical. One had what he would eventually learn was the Vethka equivalent of a deep laceration, a separation between 2 plates that had torn the connective biology underneath. Both of them looked at him, the way the first warrior would have looked at a rock that had just started walking. He treated them. He worked from the briefing files medical section, which he'd read 3 times, and from his training, and from careful observation of how each patient's physiology responded. When he wasn't sure, he went slower. He talked them through each step, not because he thought they needed the reassurance, which clearly they didn't, but because he needed the steadiness of his own voice while he figured out what he was doing. Neither of them said anything to him during treatment. Neither of them said anything to him after. He filed accurate treatment notes and ate alone, and spent the evening reading the medical file sections he hadn't gotten to yet. On the 4th day, he made a mistake. One of the warriors had a pressure bruise beneath the right dorsal plate that he'd treated with a standard compression method, the same method he'd have used on a human patient, which he'd adapted from the briefing file's recommendations. 2 hours later, the warrior came back with the bruise worse and the plate partially disengaged, and Korchet appeared from somewhere, assessed the situation with 3 seconds of looking, and corrected his technique in 2 Vethka words that the translator rendered as wrong direction. He acknowledged the correction, redid the treatment, got it right the 2nd time. Korchet left again without comment. That night, Darian went back through the medical file and found where he'd gone wrong. The Vethka plate system did not respond to compression the way human soft tissue did. The plates themselves were semi-rigid and would brace against direct pressure rather than yielding to it, which meant pushing inward made the bruising worse rather than better. You had to approach from the edges and work inward in a spiral, distributing rather than concentrating. He'd known this in theory. He'd applied the wrong theory in practice. He wrote it down 3 times until he was sure he'd remember it. On the 7th day, one of the warriors he'd treated on the 2nd day, the one with the plate separation, found him at the supply rack in the morning and held out his arm for a follow-up examination without being asked. He said nothing. He just presented the injury. He stood perfectly still while Darian examined it and found it healing correctly and said so. The warrior made a sound that the translator didn't render and left. He decided to count it. The days accumulated. He learned the shape of the unit, 11 warriors plus Veskara, whom he saw daily in a tactical capacity and never in a medical one. He learned the rhythms of their combat rotations, the specific damage patterns that came from each type of Kethsa weapon, the way the unit managed injury internally before bringing it to him. He learned that the Vethka had a high tolerance for pain and a lower tolerance for incapacitation, and that the fastest way to get them to accept treatment was to make the treatment's goal clearly about returning to function rather than about comfort. He adapted everything he knew to fit this. He stopped talking during treatment as much, unless the patient initiated. He started talking in shorter sentences, more direct, more declarative. He learned to work quickly without appearing hurried, because hurry read as incompetence and slow read as deliberation, and deliberation read as something approaching respect. On the 17th day, Veskara came to the med station for the first time in a non-tactical context. She stood outside the tent entrance and said, without preamble, "Korshet has indicated that your technique has improved." He looked up from the supply inventory he'd been reorganizing. He said that. He indicated it. A small distinction in her inflection that he was beginning to learn mattered. Korshet does not say things, he indicates them. "I'll take it." She was gone before he could say anything further. He wrote that one down too. Her name, the closest phonetic approximation a human throat could manage, was Veskara. She was a senior strike leader, which in Vethka hierarchy meant she commanded a unit of 11 and answered to no one below the High Carapace Council. She was also, by any reasonable measure of the word, dying. The ambush had come from the northern ridgeline. Darien had been 50 meters behind the forward element when the Kethsa pulse guns opened up, the air pressure cooking in that awful way it did when directed plasma interacted with humid atmosphere. He had gone flat before his brain finished processing the sound. When he lifted his head, 3 Vethka warriors were down and Veskara was upright still, which looked like survival but was actually the opposite. Her armor was locked. He didn't understand at first. The Vethka wore what humans had taken to calling plate armor, though that term was grotesquely inadequate. Their carapace system was grown rather than fabricated, a biometallic lattice that sealed over the warrior's body in overlapping plates, each one capable of independent tensioning. In combat, the system was magnificent. Each plate could harden to a density that deflected most standard munitions, could redistribute impact across the full surface, could even, at the extreme end, seal so completely that the warrior became a freestanding bunker. The problem was that the sealing worked both ways. A hit in the right place specifically, a pulse shot at close range against the dorsal connection point between the 3rd and 4th thoracic plates, could trigger a catastrophic lock. Every plate slammed to maximum compression. It protected the warrior from further harm. It also trapped them, completely. The Vethka called it the dead shell. Darien had read about it in the medical briefing files and then filed the information away under things that won't happen to me. He crossed the 50 meters at a low run with plasma burning holes in the air around him. He had nothing to shoot back with. He was a corpsman. His weapons were a trauma kit, a splint applicator, and the stubbornness that had kept him alive this long, which he'd privately decided counted as a weapon even if the Navy disagreed. Veskara did not move as he reached her. She was standing in a locked combat stance, arms slightly raised, head forward. The carapace was sealed completely, she looked, from the outside, exactly like a statue of a warrior mid-charge. Nothing was visibly wrong. From 50 meters, her own people would have assumed she was holding position. He got behind cover with her, more by pulling than by any agreement between them, and that was when he heard it. A sound like something scraping on the inside of a metal drum, very quiet, very regular, like something trying to breathe against a wall. He put his hand against her back and felt the rhythm of it, slowing. Veskara, he said it softly, not because the Kethsa would hear but because it felt important to be quiet. "Can you understand me?" The scraping sound shifted. He had been around the Vethka long enough to know that shift. It was the sound of someone trying to respond, and finding that the muscles required for speech were compressed along with everything else. She could understand him. She could not answer him. The exo-armor had a manual release. He knew this because it was in the briefing file, Section 4, Subsection 11, page 37, the kind of information buried deep enough that you assumed it would never matter. The release point was at the base of the neck, a small recess panel beneath the dorsal hood. The manual release was designed for field extraction by other Vethka, who would know how to find it, how hard to press, how to brace for the unlocking sequence. The briefing file had also noted, very clearly, that the manual release was considered an intimate access point, that the Vethka did not permit outsiders, any outsiders, to touch it under any circumstances, that attempting to access it without consent was, culturally speaking, an act roughly equivalent in violation to whatever a human would consider most sacred and most private at once. The briefing file had not specified what to do when the alternative was watching someone die. He pulled off his glove, put his bare fingers against the back of her neck. The plates were warm, almost body temperature warm, and he could feel the micro-tension in each one. The whole system was vibrating very faintly, like a machine running too hot. "I know what you're not allowed to let me do," he said. "I know, and I'm asking anyway, because you're going to suffocate in the next few minutes if I don't get this open, so you can be angry at me after. You can file whatever report you need to file. You can have me disciplined or discharged or thrown into whatever Vethka equivalent of prison exists, but right now I need you to let me do this." Silence. The scraping sound had slowed further. "I'm going to count to 3, he said. "If you don't want me to do this, find a way to tell me. Anything. Move your finger, move anything." He counted. Nothing moved. He found the panel. It wasn't where the briefing file said it was, which was the first surprise. The briefing file had been written from external observation, which meant whoever wrote it had guessed, and guessed wrong. The actual release panel was 3 centimeters lower and offset to the left, tucked just under the curve of the neck guard, where it would be invisible to anyone looking straight on. He found it by feel, by the slight temperature differential, that one small spot was cooler than the rest. He pressed it. The sound the armor made was like a held breath releasing all at once. The plates didn't spring open so much as exhale, a gradual, sequential unlocking that rippled from the neck down through the thorax, each section releasing in turn until the whole system depressurized and the carapace hung loose. Not off, still on her body, just no longer sealed. Veskara made a sound he had never heard from a Vethka before. She gasped. Not the small, controlled inhale of someone managing discomfort. A gasping, pulling breath like a drowning creature reaching surface, desperate and ugly and completely real. The armor hung loose around her and she was shaking, her whole frame shaking, and he got his hands under her arms before she went down and took her weight and held it. She was smaller than he'd expected. He couldn't have said why that surprised him. He'd been working alongside Vethka for almost a month. He had measured their vital signs, treated their wounds, administered medication. He knew they were roughly human-scaled, but with the armor loose, with the plates hanging open, he could feel what was actually inside, and what was inside was a being who was, in this moment, exhausted and trembling, and fighting very hard not to collapse in front of someone she had no obligation to trust. He did not let go. "I've got you," he said. "You're breathing, you're okay." She did not respond. She was focused entirely on the breathing, on the slow, grinding work of getting her respiratory system back online after the compression. He watched her and cataloged what he was seeing with the dispassionate part of his brain that he trained to function even when the rest of him was doing something complicated. She was breathing through dual apertures, not nostrils exactly but functional analogs, and the expansion of her thoracic cavity was different from a human's less vertical expansion, more lateral, like a bellows rather than a pump. The armor had been designed around this specific pattern of breathing, had been built to support it. When it sealed completely, it had locked the bellows in a closed position. She had been suffocating, yes, but not in the way the briefing file described. He filed this away. She straightened after about 3 minutes, which was faster than he'd expected. The shaking subsided. She pulled herself free of his support without drama, without acknowledgement that she'd needed it, and turned to face him. He had seen Vethka faces before, of course. He had treated them. But Veskara's face without the armor's hood framing it was different in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. The Vethka had a second set of what he'd been told were vestigial sensory organs running along the orbital ridge, small, dark, nearly flush with the skin, and without the shadow of the hood they were visible. They were, right now, moving, tracking him, with an intensity that was not aggression. She was reading him the way he had just been reading her. He didn't look away. "You can be angry," he said again. "I meant that. But tell me first if anything else is damaged." There was a long pause. "The second thoracic seal is cracked," she said. Her voice was different without the armor's resonance chamber, lower, rougher, stripped of the harmonic depth that made the Vethka sound like they were always speaking from inside a drum. It was also, very slightly, unsteady. "There is likely soft tissue bruising beneath the fourth plate on the left side. The lock trigger impact was concentrated there." "Show me." She showed him. The armor came away from the left side more easily than he'd anticipated. She released the plates herself, methodically, in a specific sequence that he watched carefully and memorized without deciding to. Beneath the fourth plate was what he'd have called a severe contusion in a human patient, a deep bruise that went purple-black against her lighter ventral skin, already swelling. The plate had absorbed the pulse hit but transferred the kinetic energy inward, and the tissue underneath had paid for it. He went to work. He had learned in his 3+ weeks attached to the third consolidated strike to adapt his trauma protocols. Vethka physiology was similar enough to warrant a human-derived approach and different enough that applying it uncritically would kill someone. He'd made mistakes in the first week. Small ones, nothing fatal, but he'd felt every one. He'd spent his evenings since then with the Vethka medical texts that the liaison officer had translated, bad translations, technically, but enough to orient him, and he'd cross-referenced them against his own training, until he could see the logic of both systems simultaneously. The bruised tissue needed compression, but the wrong kind of compression had just finished nearly killing her. He used a graduated wrap rather than direct pressure, building from the edges inward in a spiral pattern that distributed force rather than concentrating it. He talked while he worked, not from nerves but because the Vethka had told him, 3 weeks ago when he first started, that talking during treatment was considered respectful. It meant the healer was present, not just performing procedure. "The lock trigger mechanism," he said. "The dead shell. It's a last resort defensive response, right? Automatic once the trigger point is hit." "Correct. But the design assumes the warrior gets extracted by their unit, another Vethka who knows the release." "Correct. What happens in the field when no Vethka unit is present?" A pause that was not hesitation but calculation. "The warrior dies in the shell," she said. "This is considered an honorable death. The shell is recovered and returned to the High Carapace Council for interment." He was quiet for a moment, working the wrap. "Honorable," he said. "Yes. But you let me open it." Another pause, longer. "You offered alternatives," she said. "Anger, discipline, filing of reports. You did not demand." "You counted." She seemed to consider whether to continue. "No outsider has ever counted." He tied off the wrap and sat back. The firefight was still somewhere in the distance. He could hear the pulse signature of it, irregular now, which meant the Kethsa were either retreating or regrouping. Veskara's unit would be flanking. Standard third consolidated doctrine, which he'd memorized along with the medical texts. He handed her the armor plates he'd removed. She accepted them without speaking. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about the dead shell response." She tilted her head. The vestigial sensory organs along her orbital ridge tracked him. "Your armor is well designed," he said. "The pressure distribution, the impact transfer, the lock mechanism, all of it is exceptional engineering. But the lock mechanism has a flaw, and it's not an engineering flaw. It's an assumption flaw." "Explain." "The designers assumed that a locked warrior would either be extracted by their unit or die alone. They never designed a third option into the system. But the third option exists." He met her eyes. "It's always existed. You just had to be in a situation where someone outside the expected group was present and motivated." She was very still. "The release point," he said. "It's not where the external documentation says it is." "No. I found it by temperature, by feel." He paused. "Which means any being with functional haptic sensitivity and enough motivation could find it. It's not hidden from a determined outsider. It's hidden from a disinterested one." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fill the silence. "What are you saying?" she asked. "I'm saying your armor was designed to protect you from everyone," he said. "But it was designed by people who assumed that the only beings who would ever want to save you were other Vethka." He held her gaze. "That assumption is wrong." The firefight sounds had stopped. The quality of silence on Kareth IV's surface was different from any planet he'd served on. The local flora had a low, constant resonance, a biological hum that the Kethsa pulse weapons disrupted, and which reasserted itself in the aftermath of a fight like something reclaiming its territory. He could hear it returning now. Veskara moved without warning, not aggressively, not quickly, but with the deliberate precision of someone doing something they had decided to do. She reached up and removed the neck guard entirely, the last piece of armor that was still fully sealed, and set it on the ground between them. Without it, her face was completely visible. The secondary sensory organs, the bilateral structure of her features, the texture of her skin, which had a faint geometric patterning that he realized, looking at it, was not natural variation but fading, old markings that had been there and were slowly disappearing as her species aged. She looked, without the armor, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "The third thoracic plate on the right side," she said. "There is also damage there. I did not mention it." "Show me." She did. He worked. She talked while he treated her, which was the first time she had volunteered conversation that was not tactical. She told him about the third thoracic plate's history. It had been cracked once before, years ago, in a different engagement, and had never fully refused. She had known, for the past several engagements, that it was a weak point. She had told no one. Because in the Vethka tradition, a warrior with a known structural flaw was reassigned to support functions. She had 14 years of active strike leadership. She was not willing to become a support function. He listened without comment. When he finished treating the third thoracic plate, he organized his kit and did not offer advice about the wisdom of concealing medical information. She had not asked for his opinion on her choices. She had shared the information because she had decided to. Those were different things, and he understood the difference. "It will hold," he said, "for now, but not indefinitely." "I know. When you're ready to address it formally, the field medical record can reflect whatever narrative you choose. That's not my decision." She looked at him again in that cataloging way. "You are unusual," she said. "I'm a corpsman." "That is not what I mean." He began resealing her armor plates in the sequence she'd shown him, working from the base up, mirroring the order of her own removal. She let him. This was, he understood, a significant thing. Letting him rearm her was in some ways a greater intimacy than the opening had been. Opening was emergency. Arming was trust. He latched the final plate. "The release point," she said. "You will not share its location." It was not a question. "It's yours," he said, not mine to share. She stood, the armor sealed back into its combat configuration automatically. He could feel the micro-tensions shifting as the system ran its integrity check. She picked up the neck guard and seated it in place. Veskara, strike leader, 3rd Vethka Consolidated, was back. He didn't know what he expected. Some acknowledgement, maybe. Something that would have meaning in the cultural context of what had just happened. He'd been long enough with the Vethka to know that their gestures of regard were different from human ones, that you had to learn to read them rather than expecting them to translate. She picked up her weapon from the ground where it had fallen during the lock. She turned. She said in Vethka, not in the trade tongue they had been using, but in actual Vethka, which she had never spoken to him before. Ka Vesh, Hari Thek. He had exactly 11 words of Vethka. Ka Vesh was one of them. It meant one who breathes life into the shell. He did not know what Hari Thek meant. He added it to the 11. She walked back toward the forward position without looking back. He watched her go, and the local flora's resonance hummed up around her like a sound that had been waiting. He sat for another minute, breathing. Then he packed his kit and followed. The unit did not mention what had happened on the ridge. He'd expected something, not congratulations. The Vethka didn't run on congratulations, but some acknowledgement. An entry in the tactical record. A question from Korshet, who managed unit medical status and would presumably note that the strike leader had been treated in the field for equipment malfunction and soft tissue damage. Something. Nothing. They returned to base camp with the ridge engagement recorded as a successful defensive hold. 3 Kethsa forward scouts neutralized. No permanent casualties. Veskara filed her own report. He filed his. The reports matched in every externally verifiable detail. What happened between the 2 reports occupied the space between 2 accurate documents. Darian spent the evening after the ridge engagement doing something he had not done since his first week. He sat outside his tent and looked at the sky. Kareth IV had 2 moons, both of them small and fast-moving, and the local flora maintained its constant resonance, and the Kethsa were quiet on the other side of the ridge, and it was almost possible to forget for a few minutes that he was on a war planet. He thought about the sound of the lock releasing. In 26 days of working on Vethka casualties, he had never once heard any of them make the sound Veskara had made when the armor finally opened. He had treated deep wounds, serious wounds, the kind of damage that would have had human patients crying out. The Vethka were, uniformly, controlled, not stoic in the suppressive sense, but biologically dampened, a genuine physiological feature rather than a cultural performance. They simply did not broadcast pain the way humans did. But Veskara had gasped. Not from pain, from relief. He thought about that distinction for a long time. He thought about the moment she'd turned to face him with the armor's hood set aside, her face visible in full for the first time. He'd been treating Vethka for 26 days and had not realized, until that moment, how completely the armor had been shaping his understanding. Not because he'd been inattentive. Because the armor was so total in its design that it had functioned exactly as intended. A coherent surface that told you everything you needed to know from the outside, and nothing you weren't permitted to know. It had worked on him. He'd read the briefing file. He'd learned the protocols. He'd adapted his techniques. He'd built, over 26 days, a professional competency in treating armored alien warriors. He had not, until day 27 on that ridge, thought carefully about what the armor was protecting. He filed this as a failure of training, not his individual failure. The training had simply not been designed for someone who ended up on the other side. Every official document about the Vethka was built on the assumption that the armor was permanent, that the inside was inaccessible, that your job was to work with what was externally present. It was a reasonable assumption. It had been the correct assumption for every human attached to Vethka forces before him. Nobody had written a briefing file for the exception. He decided he would write one. Not officially, not yet. He didn't have enough data, but he started that night in his personal log with the specifics that fell outside the official documentation: the temperature differential at the release panel, the lateral bellows mechanics of Vethka respiration, the plate removal sequence, the secondary sensory organs visible only without the neck guard. Small observations. Precise ones. The kind of detail that only existed on the other side of a very specific wall. He also wrote about the counting. He sat with that for a long time, trying to render it in medical language, before deciding it didn't belong in the medical section. He put it in a separate note, titled just for himself Things That Worked. Counting to 3, he wrote, offering alternatives before acting, stating consequences plainly rather than framing them as requests, letting her decide. He stared at that last line. He added, she decided in 3 seconds. She had already decided before I counted. The counting wasn't for her. The counting was the way I kept myself from acting before she had the chance to choose. He read that back. He closed the log. The after-action report noted that the third Vethka consolidated strike leader Veskara had been rendered temporarily combat ineffective due to environmental equipment malfunction and had been returned to active status by attached human medical support. It noted that the human corpsman had performed adequately. It did not note anything else, because there was nothing else in the official record that needed noting. Darien filed his own addendum separately to the research division at Titan Station, not because he was required to, because it seemed important. He described the respiratory mechanics he had observed, the lateral expansion pattern, the bellows function, the way the armor was designed to support rather than restrict. He described the positioning of the manual release and its divergence from the external documentation. He described the temperature differential that had allowed him to locate it. He included a note at the end that was not medical in nature. It said, the Vethka armor is not designed to keep the world out. It is designed to keep the warrior intact. These are different functions that are easy to confuse from the outside. I confused them for my first 26 days. I stopped confusing them on day 27. I am including this note because I believe the distinction is operationally significant and because I believe we have been building our entire strategic model around the wrong assumption. We have been treating the Vethka armor as a wall. It is not a wall. It is a shape that something arrived at because it was the best available solution to a specific set of pressures. The Vethka do not wear armor because they want to keep us out. They wear it because nothing outside them had ever before now given them a reason to consider that letting someone in was possible. The research division at Titan Station sent back a standard receipt confirmation. 3 days later, he received a second message, not from the research division, from a contact address he didn't recognize, carrying a header notation in Vethka script that his translator rendered as Office of the High Carapace Council, External Consultation. The message said in perfect trade tongue, your addendum has been received. You have been designated Harithek. This designation carries no obligations on your part. It carries significant obligations on ours. We suggest you familiarize yourself with what it means at your earliest convenience. He looked up Harithek that evening, using a Vethka language archive that the liaison officer had never mentioned existed. It took him a while to find a translation that made complete sense. Most of the interpretations rendered it as something like bearer of the key, which seemed too simple. The extended cultural gloss went further. It described Harithek as the designation given, historically, to the being who first demonstrated that a sealed thing could be opened from the outside without breaking it, who showed that the shell was not the ending but the beginning of a conversation. The last time the designation had been awarded was, according to the archive, approximately 400 years ago. It had been awarded to another Vethka. He sat with that for a while. Then he got out the flask the chaplain had given him. It was still a third full. He'd been rationing it, and he poured a small amount onto the HFY soil outside his tent in the gesture the Vethka used to mark things that mattered. He wasn't sure he was doing it right. He did it anyway. Veskara came to him 2 weeks later, unannounced, during the quiet hour after evening stand-down, when most of the camp had gone to whatever sleep soldiers manage. She walked into the med tent with the specific directness of someone who had decided something, and was acting on the decision before the decision could unmake itself. She sat across from him. She said, "I would like you to explain the human chest cavity." He blinked. "I'm sorry. You explained to me that you understood my respiratory mechanics by observation," she said. "I have been considering the exchange and I find it inequitable. I know almost nothing about your mechanics. I would like to understand them." He stared at her. "You want me to explain my lungs?" "Your lungs, your circulatory system, the soft tissue distribution pattern. The reason humans do not have carapace despite being," she paused, choosing words, "physically exposed. We evolved in a different environment," he said, "different pressures." "Yes, explain them to me." He explained them to her. It took longer than he expected, because she asked precise questions and did not accept imprecise answers, and also because he found, in the process of explaining, that he had never really thought carefully about why humans were built the way they were, had simply taken it as given. Her questions forced him to actually think about it, which was uncomfortable and interesting in roughly equal measure. She listened with the same cataloging attention she had applied to reading his face in the aftermath of the dead shell incident. When he finished, she said, "You are very vulnerable." "Yes." "And you came onto a combat zone with no carapace." "I had body armor." "Plate over soft tissue is not a carapace." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." "Why?" He thought about it. The flask was on the table between them. He hadn't offered it because he didn't know if she drank or what she drank or whether offering it would be the right thing. He left it there. "Because we couldn't grow carapace," he said finally. "So we learned to be fast instead, and smart, and really, really difficult to kill through sheer stubbornness, which I am aware does not sound like a survival strategy, but historically it has been quite effective." She looked at the flask. "What is that?" "Fermented. I genuinely don't know what's in it." "Grain, probably. The chaplain gave it to me." "Your healers give you fermented grain." "Our chaplains aren't exactly healers. They're more," he searched for the right description. "They are people who understand that some things can't be fixed, and who stay anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "We do not have that," she said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because, in your medical tradition, everything is addressed through the integrity of the carapace. There is no protocol for the things that aren't structural." She looked at him. "You have been reading our medical texts." "Badly," he said. "The translations are not good." "No," she agreed, "they are not." She looked at the flask again. "May I?" He handed it to her. She examined it, sniffed it in a way that he was pretty sure engaged those secondary sensory organs along her orbital ridge, and then took a careful sip. Her expression shifted in a way he was learning to read. "This is terrible," she said. "Yes." "Why does your chaplain give you terrible fermented grain?" "I think," he said, "because the point was never the grain." She held the flask for another moment, took another sip, smaller, more deliberate, as if reconsidering her initial assessment, set it on the table between them. "Kavesh," she said. "What?" "What I called you on the ridge." She met his eyes. "It is not always given as a title. Sometimes it is simply an observation." A pause. "I was making an observation." He looked at her across the table in the quiet med tent in the middle of a war, on a planet that smelled like metal and rain, and felt something shift. Not in the way dramatic things shift in the stories people told about wars, not the operatic pivot of civilizations, just the small human thing of two beings looking at each other, and recognizing with some surprise that the looking was mutual. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated. She was learning the word. He could tell by the way she held it briefly before putting it down. "I will return tomorrow. I have questions about the circulatory system." "I'll be here." She stood, resealed the neck guard that she had, he realized only now, been wearing loose, walked to the tent entrance. "Stopped." "The third thoracic plate," she said, without turning. "I have submitted a repair request to the unit armor specialist. I will be placed on restricted duty for 14 days during the repair process." He said nothing. "I thought you should know," she said. "I appreciate that." She left. He sat alone in the med tent, in the resonance hum of Kareth IV, and poured another small measure onto the ground outside, this time through the tent flap, not bothering to go outside, because the gesture was the gesture regardless of precision. He thought about carcinization. Not the term exactly, not the biology. He'd never been a science student, had scraped through the relevant xenobiology courses on the strength of stubbornness rather than interest. But the idea of it, which had come up in the Vethka archive he'd been reading for the past few days, in a section about evolutionary design philosophy. The Vethka had a concept they called the perfected form, the shape that a thing arrived at when it had been tested by enough different pressures for long enough that everything unnecessary had been stripped away. They applied it to armor design, to strategic doctrine, to the structure of the High Carapace Council. They did not, as far as he had read, apply it to relationships between people. He thought that was probably because relationships weren't tested the same way, because the pressures that shaped them were not consistent or predictable, could not be run against enough cases to determine the optimal form, because every time something got close to a perfected shape, the pressures changed. He thought about the ridge, about counting to 3, about a sound like something scraping on the inside of a metal drum. He thought that maybe the perfected form was not a destination. Maybe it was just what you arrived at, temporarily, when two things under sufficient pressure decided to stop treating each other's shell as a wall. He finished the flask. He slept. She came back the next evening as she'd said she would, and the evening after that, and the one after that. It became a thing that happened without being formally established as a thing. She would appear at the med tent between stand down and sleep cycle, sit across from him at the treatment table and ask a question. He would answer it. He would sometimes ask a question back. She would answer it or not, depending on some internal calculation he couldn't fully map, and eventually she would leave, and he would sit with whatever the conversation had left in the room. She asked about the circulatory system in the first session, the lymphatic system in the second, and the nervous system in the third. The questions were precise, and the interest was genuine, and he found, working through the architecture of human biology from the outside, explaining it to someone who was encountering it as foreign, that he understood his own body better than he had before. You didn't really grasp why something was built a certain way until someone who was built differently asked you to account for the design. He started asking questions back. He asked about the biometallic growth process, how the carapace developed, at what age it fully sealed, whether it was painful. She told him it was gradual, beginning in adolescence, the plates growing from anchor points along the dorsal structure, reaching full coverage around the equivalent of a human's mid-20s. Painful was not the right word. Significant was closer. It was the primary physical marker of transition from youth to warrior status, and the culture treated it accordingly. He asked if you could choose not to seal. She looked at him for a long time. No Vethka has chosen that, she said, in any record I am aware of. But theoretically, the biological process could be interrupted. It would result in a partial carapace. This is considered, she stopped. There is not a translation. It is considered the opposite of honorable. It is the marker of a being who could not complete themselves. He thought about this. That's an interesting frame, he said, the armor as completion. It is not a frame, it is what it is. I know, I'm not arguing the value. I'm noting that we don't have an equivalent. He looked at his hands, which were unarmored and always would be. For humans, the closest equivalent is, I don't know, getting a scar maybe, evidence that something happened to you, not something you grew on purpose. Scars are random, she said. Yes. The carapace is not random. No, he considered the distinction. I think that might be the whole difference, actually, between your culture and mine. We deal with what happens to us. You build what you become. She was quiet for a while. Both have costs, she said. Yes, he agreed, both have costs. On the 9th day of her restricted duty, she arrived with a small flat container that he didn't recognize, set it on the table between them, and opened it without explanation. Inside was something that looked roughly like a very thin wafer of material that caught the light in multiple directions at once, iridescent, shifting. She picked one up and held it toward him. He accepted it. It was warm. The texture was similar to the plates of her armor, same material, same biometallic weave, but thin enough to be nearly flexible and small, fitting in his palm. He turned it over. The shifting iridescence followed the angle of the light. Carapace fragment, she said, growth shedding. When a plate replaces itself, the old material separates. She looked at the container. Warriors keep them. It is, she paused on translation, and in her pauses he had learned to hear the work of a precise mind trying to find the right equivalent. It is the record of what you were before, evidence that something happened to you. He looked at the fragment in his hand. She was watching him with the secondary sensory organs tracking, the expression doing the specific thing it did. Okay, he said. It was barely a word, barely enough to carry the weight of what he meant by it, but she had been learning the word, and by now she knew what it held. Okay, she agreed. He kept it. He put it in his kit, in the interior pocket where he kept the things that mattered, next to the chaplain's flask that was now empty, and which he had not been able to bring himself to discard. On the 14th evening, she did not come. He sat at the treatment table until well past the usual time, reviewing medical notes that didn't need reviewing, before he accepted that she wasn't coming. He didn't know if something had happened, or if the restricted duty ending meant the routine ended with it, and he sat with not knowing the way you sat with things you couldn't resolve by wanting to resolve them. He went to sleep. At dawn, the Kethsah hit from 3 directions. The third Kethsah offensive began 14 days later, which was, to the day, the last day of Veskara's restricted duty. This was not a coincidence that anyone could have planned, but it felt like one. The offensive came at dawn, from 3 directions simultaneously, which was new. The Kethsah had been strictly bilateral in every previous engagement, a tactical conservatism that the third consolidated strike had been using as a reliable constraint. The 3-vector attack meant they had either changed commanders or changed doctrine or both, and it meant that the tactical map that Veskara had been working from for the past 2 weeks was now actively dangerous. Darian was already at his forward med station when the first wave hit. He had stopped sleeping well when things were quiet. His body had apparently decided that quiet was more threatening than noise, and had been up for 40 minutes before the pulse weapons opened up and the darkness went orange. The first casualties arrived within 8 minutes. He worked. He had learned in his weeks with the third consolidated strike that the Vethka treated human medical support the way they treated most forms of outside assistance, with precise, impersonal efficiency. You were a resource. Resources were allocated as needed. This was not unkind. It was simply Vethka. It had shifted over the past 2 weeks in ways that were small but that he had cataloged. Warriors who came to him now made eye contact. Not all of them the older fighters, the ones who had been in the carapace long enough that the habit of not looking had become structural. They still came and went with their gaze fixed somewhere overhead. But the younger ones, the ones who'd been watching, they met his eyes. They also talked while he worked. Not much, not conversationally, but they told him, unbidden, the things that were relevant, which hit had done the damage, how they'd landed, what they'd felt, which plate had held and which hadn't. Information he needed that he'd previously had to extract by question and inference. Now it came to him. He noticed this. He did not comment on it, he worked. The third wave of the offensive was when things became serious. The Kethsaw's third vector attack came from a direction that the third consolidated strike had been using as a command and supply corridor, which meant it was not fortified, which meant it went directly through the section of the forward position that contained the medical tent. Darian heard the pressure change in the air, that cooking sound, and got behind the supply crates before the first pulse hit the tent frame. The frame held, the tent did not. He was working on a warrior with a ruptured dorsal seal, not his best location for a firefight, crouched over an armored casualty with no cover worth the name, when Veskara came through the gap in the tent structure. She had her weapon up and was already firing, and she moved with the complete economy of someone who had been doing this since before he was born. And the two Kethsaw who had been about to provide him with what would have been a conclusive summary of his military career were gone before he'd fully processed they were there. She put herself between him and the gap in the structure. She did not look back at him. She said in trade tongue, clipped and flat, "Can you move him?" He assessed the warrior he'd been treating. 3 minutes. "You have 3 minutes," she said, and held the gap. He finished in 2.5. She moved them to secondary cover, a firing position the unit had dug into the ridge 3 weeks earlier, and which was, he realized, something she had known about and had not mentioned to him until now, until there was a specific reason to mention it. The Kethsaw third vector attack broke apart over the course of the next 40 minutes, partly due to flanking by 2 of the third consolidated secondary elements, and partly, the after-action notes would later record, due to unexpected resistance at the medical and supply corridor that appeared to have been provided by a single strike leader operating outside her designated sector. The after-action notes would not record why she had been at the medical and supply corridor. She stayed until the firing stopped. Then she turned to him and he didn't know what he expected. An acknowledgement maybe, something tactical, something efficient. She looked at the warrior he'd been treating, who was now conscious and stable, and staring at both of them with an expression Darian had learned to read as the Vethka equivalent of very confused. She said in Vethka to the warrior, not to him, something that he did not know the words for. The warrior's expression changed. The confusion resolved into something else, something that looked from the outside like relief. He asked her later what she'd said. She told him. She had said the healer counted. He did not ask her what it meant in context. He understood what it meant in context. He went back to work. The formal ceasefire negotiations began 6 weeks later. Darian Os was not present at them, because corpsmen second class were not typically part of ceasefire negotiations, and also because he was in the medical bay at Titan Station getting his left shoulder repaired, which had taken a fragment sometime during the 6th week that he had not mentioned to anyone because they had other priorities. He was lying in the recovery bay, watching the ceiling of Titan Station move in the way ceilings moved when you were slightly over-medicated, when the message arrived. It was from Veskara. It was very short. It said, The High Carapace Council has requested that you be present at the ceasefire protocols in a consultative capacity. This is not a military request. It is a personal one. The Council has asked me to clarify. This means they are asking, not requiring. Your answer is your own. P.S. The third thoracic plate has fully repaired. I have been returned to active status. I thought you should know. He read it twice. Then he asked the med bay to connect him to the liaison officer and told them he needed a formal attendance request processed for the ceasefire protocols and that yes, he was aware he was technically still on surgical recovery, and no, he didn't think that was going to be a problem. The liaison officer said, "You're a corpsman second class." "Yes," he said. The Vethka High Carapace Council specifically requested a corpsman second class. They requested me specifically. A pause. What did you do? He thought about how to answer that. He thought about a ridge on Kareth IV, a sound like breathing against a wall, the temperature differential of one small panel slightly cooler than the rest. He thought about a flask and a language and questions about lungs, and the specific quality of an evening when two beings who had been reading each other from behind their respective shells decided, without fanfare, that the reading was sufficient. "I counted," he said. The liaison officer said nothing. "To 3, he added. "I counted to 3. He got dressed, he put on his kit, he went to the ceasefire. The transport to the designated neutral station took 9 hours. He spent most of it in a small observation berth, watching the transit to Titan Station, and then the longer leg outward to the orbital facility where the protocols were being held. His shoulder was still sore, not debilitatingly, but in the persistent way of a repair that had been done correctly but recently, and he kept his arm at a specific angle to minimize the pull on the stitching. He reviewed the Vethka language archive on his datapad. He had 47 words now, plus the phrase structures he'd assembled from context, which were probably wrong in ways he couldn't entirely identify but were better than nothing. He reviewed Harithek one more time, reading the cultural gloss carefully, the way he'd read the medical file sections in his first weeks, not to memorize but to understand the architecture of the concept. One who demonstrates that a sealed thing can be opened from the outside without breaking it. He thought about the framing of that, not one who opens the thing, one who demonstrates that it can be opened. The demonstration was the point, not the opening. The opening was the act. The demonstration was the fact made available to every other sealed thing in existence. He was still thinking about this when the transport docked. The neutral orbital facility was a joint construction, the result of the same ceasefire negotiations it was now hosting, built 2 years prior in the optimistic window between a provisional ceasefire and the resumption of hostilities that had made the word provisional earn its keep. It was designed to feel neither human nor Vethka, which meant it felt faintly like a waiting room in a hospital that couldn't decide what century it was from. He walked through it with his travel kit over his good shoulder and found his way to the conference anteroom by following the signs that were printed in both trade tongue and standard human script. He was the first human there from his side. He was not the first person in the room. Veskara was standing by the far wall, in full armor, neck guard sealed, the complete presentation of a senior strike leader attending a formal council event. She was alone. She was looking out the observation port at the star field beyond. He stopped in the doorway. She turned before he spoke, those secondary sensory organs. He understood by now registered presence at a range that sight alone didn't account for. She looked at him. He had not seen her in 6 weeks, since the night she'd told him about submitting the repair request for the third thoracic plate. 6 weeks of recovery at Titan Station, physical therapy, the grinding bureaucracy of surgical documentation, and the strange suspension of a soldier in a medical bay while a war continued without him. 6 weeks during which he had filed his addendum and received the council's message and looked up Harithek and sat with it. 6 weeks in which he had thought, more than once and with more frequency than he'd have admitted to anyone, about a flask passed across a table in a med tent and a question about lungs. "Your shoulder," she said. "Recent, it's fine." "It is not fine. You are holding it at 12 degrees of compensation." He looked at his shoulder. He was, in fact, holding it at compensation angle without having decided to. "It'll be fine," he corrected. She made the sound that wasn't quite a sound, the low subvocal register that the translator never caught, and that he had come to read as something between acknowledgement and the Vethka equivalent of a sigh. She crossed the anteroom and stopped in front of him with the deliberate precision that characterized every deliberate thing she did. She reached up and unlatched the neck guard. She did it herself, quickly, the way you did something that you were doing before you could think too carefully about doing it. The neck guard came away and she held it in her left hand, and her face was fully visible in the lighting of the anteroom, the secondary orbital organs tracking him with that specific quality of attention that he had, over the course of their months of professional acquaintance, come to understand as her version of being present. "The third thoracic plate repaired fully," he said. "I told you." "I know, I wanted to say it out loud." She looked at him. "I have been practicing human expressions," she said, "and I am told by the translation team that I am not doing it correctly." "Which expression?" "The one for," she considered the word, "gratitude with the face, the one that doesn't require speaking." He looked at her carefully, at the bilateral features, the vestigial sensory organs along the orbital ridge, moving very slightly, the expression that was not a human expression but that he had been learning to read for months, and that was, right now, doing something specific. "I think you might be doing it correctly," he said. "Just not in a way the translation team would recognize." The anteroom began to fill behind him, the formal delegations arriving, the human side with its diplomatic staff and legal team, and the 3 generals who had been negotiating the ceasefire terms since before Darien had ever set foot on Karath IV. The Vethka side with the High Carapace Council, representatives in their full formal carapace, moving with that particular combination of weight and precision that made a room feel smaller. Veskara receded the neck guard. She turned toward the main chamber doors. She said quietly, in the moment before everything became official, "Kavesh." Not as a title, he knew the difference now. "I know," he said. She walked forward into the room. He followed a step behind, which was the correct positioning for a consultative designate, a piece of protocol he had looked up specifically, and the chamber doors opened ahead of them, and the formal records of the ceasefire protocols noted, with a precision that captured the facts without the texture of them, that the session began on schedule with all designated parties present. All designated parties. He took his seat at the table's edge, not at the negotiating line, not at the observer tier, but at the consultative position that had not existed in any previous session and had been created specifically, and at the council's request. His nameplate read in both scripts exactly what the message had said it would. Darien Osei, Corpsman 2nd Class, Harithek. Across the table, the senior council representative, ancient, in full formal carapace, whose age Darien estimated at somewhere between very old and geologically old, looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to Veskara and said something in formal high-register Vethka that he caught only 3 words of. He asked Veskara afterward what the council representative had said. Veskara considered how to translate it. She said, Veskara told him, that she had wondered if this day would come again, that in 400 years the council had stopped wondering, that she was glad to have been wrong to stop. He sat with that. "What did you say back?" Veskara looked at him. The secondary sensory organs moved along the orbital ridge. The expression that the translation team couldn't catalog was doing the specific thing it did. I told her, she said, that he counted to 3. He had nothing to add to that. He did not try. And in the formal records of the negotiations that ended the 4-year Karath IV conflict, in the preamble that listed the parties present and their capacities, there is a designation that no one who wasn't there fully understood. Darian Osei, Corpsman Second Class, Harithek. Bearer of the key. The one who demonstrated that a sealed thing can be opened from the outside without breaking it. The one who counted.